Karen stood in front of a bulldozer, clutching a megaphone like it was the Constitution, screaming, "This is sacred community land," right before the blade flattened her hydrangeas, her HOA office, and her ego in one glorious sweep. Why? Because she built her suburban empire on land that wasn't hers and sank my family's boat to shut me up. Big mistake. I didn't get mad. I got legal. This isn't just a petty feud. It's a blueprint for revenge. Welcome to Monroe's Hollow. Buckle up. Karen was mid-rant when the wind changed and carried her voice across Monroe's Hollow like a siren gone rogue. But I didn't need to see her to know she was flailing her clipboard like a weaponized napkin. That's how most days started now. Someone on the HOA board having a meltdown over something they couldn't control. But me? I just stirred my coffee, leaned back in my cedar rocking chair, and watched the sun rise over the lake. I didn't just live near. I owned 60 acres of forest-wrapped water, spring-fed, untouched, and carved into the land by the calloused hands of my grandfather. The county calls it Parcel 17B. Locals call it Wyatt's Lake. I call it Monroe's Hollow because nothing echoes quite like a family name across still water. I built my life around silence. After selling my logistics company at 40, I traded boardrooms for bait, deadlines for due, and the only emails I get now comes from fishing newsletters and the occasional power outage notice. My house is a Craftsman Lodge, hand-built, sitting on the western ridge with a wraparound porch and a flagpole that hasn't missed a sunrise in 12 years. There are no fences here, just tree lines and the sound of wind combing through pine. The dock? I designed it myself. No one uses it but me and my retriever Max, who thinks he's the reincarnation of a sea captain. My permits are always current, my taxes paid early, and my coffee brewed strong enough to peel paint. It's not isolation, it's sovereignty. I don't hide from the world, I just don't invite it in. So when Crystal Pines broke ground a mile east, I didn't think much of it. Another HOA development with cookie-cutter promises and a brochure that looked like it was designed by a yoga studio. Eco-integrated, community-forward, lifestyle-enhanced, whatever that means. I figured they'd keep to their grids, build their vinyl castles, and pose with their HOA president for neighborhood newsletters. I was wrong. They didn't just settle, they spread. First it was the trail signs, then the QR codes on the trees I'd planted. By the time someone stapled a Crystal Pines welcome loop map to my gatepost, I knew they had ambition. Then came the envelope, pastel yellow embossed with sunflowers and labeled Friendly Design Guidance. It was slipped into my mailbox like a love letter from a stalker. Inside was a neatly formatted document requesting that I reconsider the exterior color palette of the boathouse on the east-facing shore, as it clashes with the earth-toned harmony visible from the Crystal Pines outlook deck. They included swatches, actual paint swatches. I laughed so hard I had to sit down, because it was funny, but because someone actually thought my property, my legacy, was a visual inconvenience. I didn't write back. I didn't email. I walked down to the fire pit, lit the envelope with a pinecone torch, and watched the swatches curl into ash. That was the first shot. I didn't realize it then. I thought it was just HOA nonsense, a misunderstanding. But HOA Karen doesn't misunderstand. She calculates. The lake may have been mine on paper, in taxes, and in every sense it matters, but she looked at it like a blank canvas waiting for regulation, and I could feel it. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. Wearing a smile, carrying a clipboard, and painting over boundaries that weren't hers to touch, they did not the second time. Just taped another envelope to my gatepost. This one peach-colored with daisies. Inside was a 3-page compliance suggestion regarding the tone and visibility of my private dock sign, which simply read, "Private property. Violators will be fed to the fish." Apparently, humor was no longer considered harmonious in the community visual landscape. A week later came another, this time objecting to my bird feeder for its unregulated seed scat, followed by one about the non-standard incline of my driveway, which is, for the record, a damn hill carved by nature and generations of footsteps. They weren't rules, they were attempts at control wrapped in clip art and passive aggression. The propaganda campaign escalated from envelopes to actual boots on dirt. One morning, I stepped outside to find a glossy wooden bench newly installed at the far edge of my East Ridge Trail, my land, complete with a plaque reading, "Donated by the Crystal Pines Beautification Committee." The stain was still tacky. I walked over, snapped a photo, and traced the border with my GPS. They had crossed the line by 11 feet and 5 inches. Didn't call, I didn't ask. I dismantled the bench, plank by plank, and left it in a polite pile just inside their side of the border like a returned casserole dish after a toxic potluck. 2 days later, they installed laminated trail maps with QR codes on birch trees I planted before half of them were even born. My forest was becoming a brochure. Then came Tucker. Tall, khaki-clad, the kind of guy who wears sunglasses on cloudy days and calls his Bluetooth earpiece a device. He walked up my porch steps with a smile that was 90% performance and 10% arrogance. "Wyatt," he said, like we were old friends sharing a mortgage. "I'm here as a liaison, just trying to build some neighborly understanding." I sipped my coffee, didn't offer a seat, and replied, "Then understand this. You're standing on private property and you got 30 seconds before I release the neighborly hounds." He laughed until Max, my retriever, padded up behind me with his "don't mess with my dad" stare. The Tucker was gone before I counted to 10. So much for understanding. Karen made her debut the next morning. I was tightening a line on the dock when I heard the unmistakable rhythm of platform sandals on gravel. Sharp, fast, performative. She wore a white linen blouse, a massive sun hat that looked like it had its own Wi-Fi signal, and carried an iPad like it was the Magna Carta. "Mr. Monroe," she began, her tone suggesting I'd failed a quiz I didn't know I was taking. "As president of the Crystal Pines Homeowner Association, I'd like to open a dialogue regarding your use of shared visual space." I blinked. "This isn't shared," I said. "It's mine. Has been since before your HOA broke ground." She smiled like I was a child who just mispronounced a big word and replied, "Well, the community sees things differently. We have to think collectively now." She went on, about neighborhood cohesion, about preserving lakeside energy, about how my flagpole could be perceived as aggressively traditional. I let her talk. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. Because as she stood there, spinning bureaucratic fluff into faux legal cotton candy, I realized something. She wasn't here to ask. She was here to claim. Not with deeds, not with rights, but with tone, presence, and paperwork made in a printer bought with HOA dues. That was the moment I stopped underestimating her. Karen didn't just want influence, she wanted dominion. And she was willing to gaslight an entire shoreline to get it. They came at dusk, thinking the shadows would keep them hidden. 2 HOA board members in matching polos, khaki shorts, and that unmistakable air of suburban self-importance. One held a clipboard, the other had a measuring wheel, the kind you see city engineers use, but instead of a hard hat, he wore a visor and a Bluetooth headset. I watched them from the porch, coffee in hand, not bothering to hide, let them think they were subtle. What they didn't know was that I'd already installed 6 trail cameras around the lake, originally for wildlife, now repurposed for HOA incursions. The next morning, I printed the clearest photo, laminated it, stapled it to a wooden stake, and planted it at the head of the lake trail in bold red letters, "Smile for the lawsuit," with arrows pointing at their faces. That was the moment things escalated. They didn't respond with an apology or retreat. This was an HOA. They responded with a Facebook post. The Crystal Pines community page published a photo of the lake at sunrise, my lake, mind you, with a caption, "We remind residents to report unauthorized vessel activity and unlicensed watercraft operating outside of HOA guidelines. Safety and sustainability come first." The comments lit up. Residents chimed in with phrases like "eyesore" and "who does he think he is?" I didn't reply for a full day. Then, calmly, I logged in, commented under their post with one sentence. "The only unauthorized activity I see is trespass and slander. My legal team thanks you for the screenshots." Within an hour, the post was deleted, but not before I archived it, along with every like, share, and emoji reaction. They didn't stop, of course not. That week, I started noticing teenagers in HOA vests walking the perimeter trails with iPads. They looked like mall security interns on a nature hike. One of them, probably 16, approached me while I was refueling Ruby May, my 1971 Cedar Strip fishing boat. "Sir," he began nervously, Do you have a lake usage permit on file with the Environmental Oversight Committee? I stared at him, then at the patch on his vest, which was clearly embroidered at a kiosk. That committee doesn't exist, I said. Yet, he replied, smiling like he'd won a debate. I shook my head, muttered something about kids these days, and walked away. 2 hours later, a pastel envelope appeared under my windshield wiper at the grocery store. Inside, a full-color trifold brochure announcing the formation of the Crystal Pines Environmental Preservation Board. I nearly laughed in the parking lot. But they weren't kidding. A week later, I received an official-looking document, thick paper, fake gold seal, multiple signatures, in cursive font. It was titled, Notice of Violation, Vessel-Based Pollutant Hazard. It claimed that Ruby May, my family's hand-built fishing boat, maintained better than most HOA yards, was a potential ecological threat and a non-conforming lakeside visual pollutant. The wording was so pretentious it sounded like it was co-written by a thesaurus and a yoga influencer. They even included a chart with a boat's length compared to acceptable shoreline optics, whatever that meant. At the bottom, in bold print, was a fine, $45, 0 cents due in 10 days, or escalated enforcement procedures would follow. Under that, the vessel has been added to Tier 1 of the community watch list. It wasn't the amount, it was the gall. This wasn't a warning, it was a shot across the bow, a declaration of war written in serif font. They didn't want me to pay, they wanted me to fold, to submit, to scrub my life clean of anything that didn't match their manufactured harmony. I stood on the dock that night, watching the moonlight ripple off the hull of Ruby May, fingers clenched tight around that ridiculous letter. They thought this was about aesthetics. But what they didn't realize yet, what Karen hadn't grasped, was that when you push a man off his own land, there's nowhere else for him to go. Except forward. I didn't scream, I laughed. Not a chuckler smirched, but a deep, belly-rattling laugh that left Max tilting his head like I'd lost it. I'd just finished reading the latest HOA masterpiece, that glossy violation notice, accusing my boat, Ruby May, of being an aesthetic threat and ecological liability. They even cited something called the Community Lakeside Vision Act, which, spoiler alert, doesn't exist. I stuck the notice to the fridge with a trout-shaped magnet and went about my night. If they thought a fine printed-in brush grip font was going to make me surrender a 52-year-old family heirloom, they clearly didn't know who they were dealing with. Ruby May wasn't just a boat. She was the last thing my father ever built with his hands, and the first place I ever felt peace. The lake was calm that next morning. Too calm. Not a single ripple out of place. I walked out to the dock with my mug, expecting to find Ruby May bobbing lazily where I left her. Instead, I found empty cleats and frayed rope fluttering like torn flags in the breeze. No drift marks, no splash patterns, no signs of her drifting loose. She hadn't floated away, she'd been taken. I rushed to check the trail cams. 3 had mysteriously shut off around 2:12. AUM and all files corrupted or erased. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. This wasn't a prank. It was surgical and silent, the kind of silence that feels orchestrated. That's when I saw her, Karen, gliding across the lake on a paddleboard like some smug suburban sea witch. White linen, oversized sunglasses, sun hat wide enough to block the moon. She wasn't paddling, just drifting, letting the current do the talking. She pulled up near the dock and gave me a pity smile. "Look for something?" she asked. I didn't blink. "You have one chance to tell me where my boat is." She tilted her head. "Oh, it's still here," she said sweetly, "just submerged. We've safely relocated it beneath the lake surface as part of an emergency environmental response." I stared at her, stunned. "You what?" "Hazardous materials mitigation," she replied as if she were reading from a PowerPoint. It was causing visual discord and risk contaminating the community's lakeside view. "This isn't your lake," I snapped. She pulled out her iPad and spun it around, some amateur Photoshop with boundary overlays claiming the waterline. "Not according to our bylaws," she chirped, and then paddled off like she'd just solved world peace. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't post online. I went to the shed, pulled out my wetsuit, weights, and flashlight. Max watched me suit up without a word, as if he already knew this wasn't a fishing trip. The water was cold, blindingly so, but I didn't hesitate. I dove, kicking through the silt, scanning with my beam. 10 minutes in, I found her. Ruby May was resting on her side in 15 feet of muck, her bow cracked, tow rope severed, and her brass fittings dull with sludge. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Someone had sunk her with precision. My lungs burned by the time I surfaced, and my hands shook not from cold, but from fury. I stood on the dock, dripping, staring into that mirror-flat lake while the morning sun rose like it had no idea what had just happened. I dried off, walked inside, and peeled the violation notice from the fridge. For a second, I almost laughed again. But this time there was no humor left. Just steel. Just silence. I folded the paper neatly, set it on the table, and stared out the window at the dock where Ruby May used to rest. That wasn't a fine, that was war, and she just sunk the one thing I loved most. Without ever understanding what she'd truly awakened, I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with wet hair, lake water still clinging to my boots, staring at the crumpled violation notice like it had just confessed to arson. Karen hadn't just crossed the line. She'd submerged a legacy and smiled while doing it. I knew then this wasn't going to end with arguments or emails. This needed to be settled in the language Karen worshipped. Documents, deeds, proof. So I walked to the old barn out back, the one with rusted hinges and a padlock no one but me had touched in years. Inside, beneath layers of dust and history, was a steel filing cabinet welded shut by my grandfather sometime before disco died. I grabbed my grinder, cut it open, and found what I was looking for. A manila folder marked Surveys Do Not Lose. The paper inside was yellowed and fragile, but the ink hadn't faded. Hand-drawn, topographic surveys, plat maps, assessor notations, all dated from 1952, signed by a county clerk who'd been dead for 3 decades. One by one, I laid them out on the barn workbench, aligning north markers, tracing property lines with a ruler. My land, my lake, my easement trails, my ridge line. It was all there, documented with a level of precision that would make a modern GIS analyst weep. Then I pulled out a copy of the Crystal Pine zoning application I'd requested months earlier and never bothered to read. I laid it on top of my grandfather's maps. The borders didn't match. Their rear building line, where the HOA headquarters now sat, pushed a full 35 feet over onto my land. Not a corner, not a sidewalk. The whole damn back half of the building, complete with a solar roof and a professionally landscaped garden, was built on what legally belonged to me. I stared at the discrepancy for a long time. It could have been an error, a lazy surveyor, a zoning shortcut, but knowing Karen, it wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated land grab, hidden behind the illusion of progress and flower beds. I needed confirmation. So I called Connor Fielding, a retired county land engineer who owed me a favor from a fencing dispute I helped him win in 2015. He showed up that afternoon with a toppled drone, a laser plotter, and a measuring wheel that looked like it belonged in a sci-fi movie. We walked the perimeter, flagged every marker, and by sunset we had a fully mapped 3D overlay of the entire zone. Connor stared at the tablet screen, whistled low, and said, "They're not just over the line, Wyatt, they're in another zip code." He was right. The HOA building's foundation, patio, and even the underground irrigation pipes snaked well into my property. They'd installed lighting fixtures, concrete pathways, and a commemorative plaque on land they never owned. I took photos, time-stamped them, then filmed a walkthrough of every inch of the encroachment. My voice was calm, but my hands were steady as stone. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was reclamation, the kind that doesn't need threats or theatrics, just a truth so heavy it flattens every lie beneath it. I ended the night sitting on a bench just outside their building, my bench technically. I watched the automatic lights flicker on, illuminating their glass walls like a fishbowl of fraud. They had thrown every HOA letter, every fake committee, every clipboard warrior at me, and while they were busy patrolling duck feeders and policing mailbox paint, they never once thought to check if their precious castle stood on stolen earth. But I had. And I wasn't about to let that go, not after Ruby May, not after the lies, not when the dirt under their empire still remembered my family's name. I didn't roar, I drafted. While Karen flailed her clipboard and weaponized rumor, I sat at my dining table with a stack of proof so thick it could anchor a boat. Survey maps, deed copies, time-stamped drone overlays, all lined up with military precision. I wrote the notice myself, no lawyer needed. 1 page, formal, factual, and cold as a scalpel. 2. Crystal Pines Homeowners Association. This structure has been verified to occupy 3,200 square feet of land belonging to Wyatt J. Monroe. You are hereby ordered to vacate the premises and remove all improvements within 30 calendar days. Failure to comply will result in legal action under county trespass and misuse statutes. This is not a request. I signed it with a pen older than their HOA and sealed it in an envelope so thick it could cut skin. But I didn't just send it to Karen, I sent it to every board member, certified mail. I have filed a copy with the zoning board, the tax assessor's office, and the county clerk. Then I uploaded the drone overlays to a public Google Drive and posted the link with one caption, "Transparency Matters." I printed a vinyl sign and staked it 10 feet in front of their building. Warning, this structure is illegally built on private property. Documentation on file, eviction pending. The next morning, the HOA board woke up to photos of the sign circulating online, shared by local Facebook groups with captions like "HOA built on stolen land" and "Karen's Kingdom" in question. By noon, 2 local news reporters had called me for comment. I didn't give them a rant. I gave them facts. Karen didn't handle it well. She called me that evening from a number I didn't recognize, voice shrill and cracking like ice under weight. "You think you can bully a community into silence?" she barked. "We're a nonprofit, Wyatt. You can't just evict an entire neighborhood office." I took a sip of coffee, then answered, "Karen, you built your clubhouse on someone else's soil. That's not a nonprofit. That's squatting with Wi-Fi." It's hung up. The next day, Crystal Pines released an emergency newsletter titled "Community Under Siege." It featured a cartoonish map showing my property shaded in blood red, a paragraph accusing me of being a sovereignty radical, and a claim that I was plotting to privatize the lakefront ecosystem. They taped it to mailboxes, tucked it under windshield wipers, even tried handing it to Max while we were on our morning walk. Max peed on it. While Karen was orchestrating a panic parade, I was drafting legal motions. 1 for trespass, 1 for land misuse, 1 for property tax fraud, just to spice things up. I documented every foot of unauthorized construction, every event they'd hosted, every newsletter that falsely labeled my lake as communal. I hired a civil engineer to verify the building's code compliance or lack thereof, and ordered a soil impact report just to be thorough. I wasn't just throwing paper, I was building a case with the weight of granite. Quiet, methodical, unstoppable. Because this wasn't about a boat anymore, it wasn't even about land. It was about truth. Karen wanted to run a kingdom on lies, built with rules no one voted for and forced by fear and pastel envelopes. But I had something stronger than fear, a deed, a bloodline, and a binder full of evidence that made her HOA look like a high school group project turned cult. She wanted war by policy? Fine. I was ready to wage it by blueprint. And by the time the last line was drawn, her office wouldn't need a permit. They would need a demolition crew. The demolition order came down on a Thursday, stamped with the county seal and signed by a judge who, according to local rumor, had once fined an HOA for harassing a guy over holiday inflatables. The official reason? Environmental noncompliance. Turns out, the HOA's sleek glass-walled headquarters, built with pride and questionable permits, had a hidden septic overflow pipe draining straight into Monroe's Hollow. I documented the leak, filed the report, and let the county's environmental officer finish the sentence. The rest was bureaucratic poetry. Between the illegal construction, zoning violations, and environmental hazard, the judge gave them 10 days to vacate and 0 room to appeal. The final line read like a song. Structure to be demolished. Responsible party, Crystal Pines HOA. That morning, I brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to restart a dead tractor and stood on my porch as the demolition crew rolled in. 2 bulldozers, 1 backhoe, 3 trucks full of men in hard hats who looked like they'd been waiting their whole lives to legally flatten something. Sheriff Nolan Colton arrived in his cruiser, leaned against the hood, and tipped his hat in my direction. "Morning," he said. "It's like showtime." At precisely 7:05 a.m., the first rumble started until it was drowned out by the shriek of a megaphone. Karen, dressed in a bright red pantsuit 3 shades too loud, sun hat pinned down like she was preparing for a hurricane. She marched straight toward the lead bulldozer and threw herself in front of it, arms outstretched like she was auditioning for martyrdom. "This is community space," she screamed, voice cracking like cheap glass. "This is illegal. We have rights." Sheriff Colton didn't even flinch. "Ma'am, please step aside. This is a court-ordered demolition on verified private property." Karen spun around to face the crowd. Yes, there was a crowd now. Neighbors, reporters, a few HOA loyalists in Crystal Pines polos, all watching the last act unfold. "Don't let him do this," she pleaded. "This is our land." I stepped forward, pulled out my certified land deed, and held it high. "No, Karen," I said, voice steady, clear. "This is my land. Yours was a rental fantasy built on stolen ground. Time to move out." Colton gave the signal. One of his deputies gently escorted Karen away, still yelling, still flailing, still believing she could outshout property law. Then the blade dropped. The first bite tore through the manicured flower beds like a lion through confetti. Hydrangeas exploded, solar path lights snapped like matchsticks. The founders of Crystal Pines' dedication plaque broke clean in half. Then came the glass wall. One satisfying crash as the conference room, coffee station, and framed fake bylaws shattered into dust. Someone in the crowd yelled, "Justin!" Another added, "That's for mailbox paint." The bulldozers didn't pause. They roared, chewed, and crushed until nothing remained but concrete chunks and a bent aluminum flagpole. Karen's dream had become mulch. And then came the cherry on top. Brand, the HOA's vice president, a guy who'd never made eye contact but always carried a tablet like it was a weapon, tried to sneak out the back. Clutching a laptop and a banker's box full of binders, he looked like a tax auditor fleeing a crime scene. "Leaving so soon?" I called. He froze, turned around, stammered, "This is evidence. We were just going to submit it to the county." I smiled, stepped closer. "Don't worry, Brent. The county already subpoenaed your budget reports." A deputy took the box. Brent deflated like a pop pool toy. Somewhere in the wreckage behind us, a metal beam groaned and collapsed like punctuation. The last wall came down just after 8 a.m., dust rising like a funeral pyre for paper tyranny. I stood beside Colton, watching the cleanup crew sweep through the rubble. "Hell of a thing," he muttered. I nodded. "Yeah, it was never just about the land." He raised an eyebrow. "Then, what was it about?" I looked out across the lake, where sunlight now hit the water uninterrupted. "Ruth. Boundaries. And the cost of pretending other people's property is yours, until the ground itself says otherwise." A week after the dust settled, I laid the stone. Not some flimsy plaque or printable sign, but a hand-carved slab of granite, pulled from the quarry 2 counties over, and etched by a local mason who'd once been fined by the HOA for having unauthorized seasonal decor. I told him I'd pay double if he made the words sharp enough to draw blood. We set it right where the Crystal Pines headquarters used to stand. Now just a scar in the soil, half-grown with wild grass. Stone was clean, heavy, eternal. It read, "Here fell the house of arrogance, returned to the earth it never owned." People stopped to take pictures. Some clapped. One woman left a bouquet of plastic hydrangeas. Fitting, really. Karen's kingdom now a cautionary tale in rock. But I wasn't finished. Not until Ruby May came home. I hired a recovery crew out of Asheville, guys who specialized in pulling up old wrecks and making them breathe again. It took a full day, 2 divers, and a crane that looked like it was built for oil rigs, but she surfaced. Waterlogged, scraped, but not broken. I stood on the shore as they lifted her out of the lake like she was rising from battle. Ropes dripping, cedar planks groaning, brass trim dulled but unbent. She looked tired, proud, alive. I spent the next month sanding, sealing, rewiring. I varnished her bow until it caught the morning light like fire. When she was ready, I docked her in the same place she always belonged, with one new addition. A sign posted on a post beside her, carved in oak and sealed in resin. It read, "Private. Trespassers will be filmed, fined, and featured." Karen never came back. Her Mercedes disappeared 3 days after the demolition. Word was she moved to Florida. Fitting. Within a month, the Crystal Pines HOA dissolved, citing unsustainable legal exposure and community division. In translation, their empire was built on sand, and I'd turned on the tide. The county launched a full investigation into misuse of dues. Turns out, the Environmental Preservation Fund had paid for Karen's backyard gazebo 3 spa weekends, and a leadership retreat at a vineyard in Napa. All the fines they issued, voided. All citations, reversed. They even refunded 24 homeowners for paint jobs they never asked for. Justice wasn't just served, it was itemized, audited, and signed in triplicate. When the press finally showed up, 2 local papers, 1 regional affiliate, and a podcast guy who brought a drone and wore socks with pineapples, I gave them the same line I'd rehearsed 100 times in my head. Standing at the edge of Monroe's Hollow, flag snapping in the wind, Ruby May floating behind me, I said, I'm not anti-community, I'm anti-theft dressed as community. There's a difference. One reporter asked if I felt vindicated. I said, no, I feel sober. This never should have happened, but since it did, it needed to be answered, and now it has. That quote ended up in 3 headlines. One of them called me the man who bulldozed an empire with a map. I like that one. Now things are quiet. The lake is still, the birds came back, Max naps on the dock like nothing ever happened. But sometimes when the breeze shifts just right and the last light hits the water, I swear I can still hear the echo of Karen's megaphone. Shrill, desperate, already fading. I sip my coffee on the porch, boots up, flag flying, not just because it's tradition, but because it's a reminder that peace isn't passive. It's earned, held, defended, and if need be, etched in stone for the next fool who mistakes silence for surrender. If there's one lesson to take from this saga, it's this. Never underestimate a guy with a deed, a grudge, and a wetsuit. Land isn't just dirt, it's history, legacy, and sometimes the final line between peace and petty tyranny. This story isn't just about HOA madness or sunken boats. It's about standing your ground, literally, and refusing to be guilt-tripped, gaslit, or clipboarded into submission. So next time someone tells you your mailbox violates neighborhood vibes, ask them if their office is sitting on stolen land. Thanks for watching, folks. If you laughed, cheered, or mentally bulldozed your own HOA while listening, hit that like button, drop your favorite HOA horror story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of justice served cold and legally. And remember, peace is great until someone messes with your dock. Then it's war. Classy, quiet, legally binding war.